when we're allowing our head to stay stuck in believing different lies. And so I was believing this crazy lie that I was being rejected by my kids when they're doing what we've been training them to do.
What you raised them to do.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But then I was also allowing this lie that my identity was 100% wrapped up in being a mom. And I needed to remember, and I still need to remember, that first and foremost, I am a daughter of a king. I am chosen. I am treasured. I am valued. And so that has been the bigger part of my journey, is really trying to decipher what lies am I believing? Because when you're believing those lies and you have a lot on your plate, it leads to burnout quickly.
Hi, welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast. This podcast is brought to you by BJU Press Homeschool. Homeschooling is an exciting adventure we take with our children. One of the most challenging parts of this journey is choosing the curriculum you want to use. BJU Press Homeschool is a curriculum you can trust. All the books, resources, and videos have been designed with you and your child in mind. Their curriculum is educationally robust and rich, taking into account that children have different learning styles, strengths, and needs. Mom, you are in charge. BJU Press Homeschool is here to come alongside and support you. Do you need help with the teaching load, or is there a subject you just don't want to teach? Their amazing video courses are available for all grades and almost every subject. BJU Press Homeschool believes that homeschooling can produce a new generation of students who know God, love their neighbors, and stand firm in their faith. For more information, go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast, where our goal is to help you thrive in your homeschool journey. Let me take just a minute to ask you to please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen or watch, including YouTube. And if this podcast has been encouraging to you, please leave us a good review. Each review really helps us and helps other families like yours to find us. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We post a lot of content there. Well, I am really excited today to welcome my dear friend Kristi Clover to the podcast. Kristi is a home organization guru and expert. She is the most unique blend I have seen of warmth, enthusiasm, creativity, resourcefulness, faith, compassion, and depth. To watch Kristi care for her home while loving, teaching, challenging, inspiring, and totally enjoying her 5 children is like observing a master artist at work on a life-size canvas. Kristi is the author of MOM, Master Organization of Mayhem, a captivating and life-changing speaker and podcast host, and a totally devoted wife and mother and friend. And she's so funny. So welcome, Kristi. Thanks for being here. Kristi, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I am so happy to be here with you. I will take any dose of Zan I can get, whether in person or online.
Well, we've had a fun day. We did the podcast together. You're one of the new hosts for Schoolhouse Rocked podcast.
Yes.
And so we spent about an hour and a half podcasting for that. So that was a lot of fun. We talked about how to keep your homeschool from being boring, having a life-giving homeschool. And so we're going to sort of switch topics here. I want us to talk about what happens in January, February, and early March a lot as a homeschool mom. And I think this time of year, our temptation is toward a little bit of depression and burnout. The weather is cold. It can be gloomy outside. We've had some storms. Christmas is over, and we have these long 3 or 4 months until the end of the school year. And sometimes it's just a lot to deal with.
Yeah, no, it can be really tough with my husband he's a sunshine boy. Like, I think he's solar operated. Like, if the sun's not out, then he's like, ooh, 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 ooh. Yeah. Which cracks out. We live in San Diego. So, I mean, we get a lot of sunshine.
Yes,
but,
you do.
Fun fact, I was born in Oregon. So I think the Oregonian in me, I'm like, oh, when the clouds come, I'm like, let it rain, and I get excited by that. So
that's
it doesn't bother me. Yeah,
yes,
it does not bother me. So.
Well, I am like your husband. I like the sunshine, and I'm definitely affected by that. The weather, the warmth, the sun, all of those things. So Joe and I have had a great time this year. We visited several states that know how to celebrate winter. We were in Washington State, we were in Chicago, and we were in North Dakota. And they all have a beauty of their own. And yet I noticed that this really is a good time to do women's events and retreats and to help us refocus on joy. So you had a podcast that you have just wrapped up called Simply Joyful. So tell us a little bit about that and what your last few years have been like.
Yeah. So when I launched my book, MOM, Master Organizer of Mayhem, I think I was already 2 years into the podcast, had taken a break for writing and, kind of getting ready. So we brought the podcast back when the book was launching. And it's one of those things that my little story of burnout kind of comes with. I had all these things layered. Like I'm big on don't say too much, don't say yes to too many things at once. But sometimes it's a little bit out of our control. So when I was launching the book, we were bringing back the podcast. So I had like a PR person I was paying. And so like we were paying somebody, you're like, got to do what they tell me to do. So I had all these things on my plate from an online business perspective. Plus our homeschool is starting off. And the whole backside of my house was ripped apart because we were renovating. So we had a lot of things happening all at once and kind of throw in some, family dynamics and things just from my childhood that were popping up. And I had the perfect storm to burn out. And so as I was wrapping up my podcast with my last several episodes, because I already knew I wanted to close it out. And I think it was about the time that 2020 and the pandemic was hitting. And so it was nice to have a podcast because you could do things this way. But at the same time, I was struggling and I was running on fumes. And I was kind of laughing to myself. I'm like, I cannot believe I'm struggling this hard. And my podcast is called Simply Joyful. So I'm like, God is faithful and he gave me the strength to finish out. And then when I was done, I think he was also faithful putting it on my heart to stop. Because when I stopped, it allowed me the room to really step back from all things online. I slowed my speaking schedule down. I slowed everything down and had some time to kind of grieve some things and had time to kind of heal. And so it was a long journey, counseling, different ministries that I was a part of that really helped with that healing.
So tell me what your definition is of burnout and maybe how that compares to depression. And are they one and the same or are they different?
It's a great question. I'm like, we should ask ChatGPT. So I live my life now. I'm like, I don't know. In fact, my son does it. He's like, Mom, just ask Chat. And I'm like, no, I know the answer. He's like, no, ask Chat. I'm like, no. But I think they can be separate. I think you can be depressed without being burnt out. I think you can be burnt out without being depressed. And I think you can be both at the same time. And so I had the perfect storm. I was both depressed and burned out. And I'm sure that the burnout helped kind of lead towards
Fuel
depression.
the depression, yes.
Yeah. So burnout, I think, happens when you're depleted. You've got too much on your plate. My favorite way of describing it is that instead of bringing a candle at both ends, you just throw the whole thing in. So I definitely was burned out. I was the end of myself, and not like a normal, I'm tired, it's been a long day burnout. It was like, I need like a month to take off. And then depression to me is defined more of a deep sadness. So when I say I was burned out, like I've been burned out before, you slow down and things are good. But with my depression, what I learned is that the source of that depression really was coming from this emotional area of feeling hopeless. So oftentimes when I was reaching a point where, different emotions were starting to take over, when I started feeling hopeless, like nothing's going to change, and I was questioning the Lord during that time too. Like, God, have all this emotional baggage from my childhood. I have all these different things. They're like, why are you allowing me to still feel so hurt? Why are you creating circumstances where people can hurt me and allowing that to happen? And so I was kind of starting to feel hopeless. And so that's when I started really struggling with depression and kind of questioning a lot of different things. Never my fate, but always just like I didn't understand. So I was kind of searching for understanding, if that makes sense.
We had a pastor's wife and her husband, our pastor, would get clinically depressed from time to time. And she explained it to me this way. She said, if Joe is down in the dumps, you might take him out to dinner or go see a movie or
Yeah.
something, and it sort of cheers you up. She said, I can do that, and it doesn't make a difference. And so it's a no joke thing
Yeah. Oh, no, it was tough. And I
to
remember
go through.
telling Steve at one point, I'm like, "I think I need some counseling." And he was just kinda like, "Hey, I think I need some counseling."
Yeah.
That's how I attack
Right,
things.
right.
And he's like, "I don't know, do you think?" And, like, the next day, like, I just had another layer, and I just think the Lord just allowed me to really hit bottom. And, when he spent the entire evening holding his sobbing wife, who I could not stop crying, and he's like, "Okay, I think that counseling thing you were talking about sounds like a really good idea." Like, yeah, like, I couldn't stop. It's just not like me at all.
Yep, sometimes life just piles up on you.
Yeah.
W One of the things I did a few years after coming on with BJU Press Homeschool and Homeworks by Precept was to write a book called Refined, A Homeschool Mom's Call to Trust, and it's really a 90-page little book on burnout. And, I've always said if you've homeschooled for more than 3 hours, you've probably suffered some form of burnout because
Amen.
homeschooling is all about self-giving. I mean, at the end of the day, it's giving yourself constantly for others. And certainly that's not the only way to live a self-giving life, but homeschooling certainly does demand that of us.
Yeah.
And so in the book, I talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrew men who were kidnapped with Daniel by Nebuchadnezzar when Babylon took over Israel and defeated Israel, obliterated Israel, or tried to. And so they come back and they are thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's elite school along with Daniel. Talk about compulsory attendance. But the goal of that education was to obliterate in these three men every vestige of Israel and Israel's God. They wanted them to be secular men or to believe in the gods of Babylon, not the God of Israel. And so I love the story about them eventually being thrown in the furnace for their faith. And Nebuchadnezzar, challenges them and says, let's see if your God can protect you now. And of course, we all know the story. God did protect those three men. I've always said that burnout is like being in the fiery furnace without seeing the fourth man and being consumed by our circumstances, because we know that once the three men were thrown into the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar hops up. Evidently, this was some furnace he could see into, and he said, how many men did we throw in there? And they said, you threw in three men bound. And he said, well, I see four men walking around and they're unbound. And so we really believe that that was Jesus. He made an appearance to these three and took the circumstances of that fiery furnace and made it something that didn't hurt them, but showed them his glory in a very meaningful way. And I've often thought they were expecting to go to their death. Then they find out that not only are they alive, they're unbound. So who unbound their chains? Jesus had to unbind their chains. And I've thought, what would those few minutes, or we don't know how long it was. We don't know if it was 5 minutes, an hour, but just those few minutes of being with Jesus changed their life. They were, I'm sure, different men from that time until the time that they went to be, with Jesus in heaven, in glory. But I do feel like that burnout is a real thing. It's not our imagination, but it's really being consumed by our circumstances. And sometimes as homeschool moms, we just get to the end of our ropes. And I have always, I still believe that it is being in those circumstances without seeing the fourth man. Jesus is the healer. It doesn't mean that the healing is easy or the circumstances are fun, but somehow he redeems even, even the fiery furnaces, even the burnout. So what do you think in your life contributed to burnout?
In my life, the burnout was a lot of circumstantial things. So we had, I had taken too many commitments. So that definitely handed, me a big thing, as far as having too much on my plate. But then on top of that, I mean, Steve and I were struggling in our marriage. We had some family dynamics, some things with our kids. We were getting ready to launch our kids, and that was very difficult in that season. And what's interesting is kind of through what I've learned about myself is one of my go-to lies that I too often allow the enemy to speak over me is that I'm being rejected. And so that when we were getting ready to launch the boys, for some reason in my brain, it was tapping into you're being rejected. And so that was not a happy thing. But as like, once I figured that part out, I'm like, no, they're not rejecting me. They're growing up. This is good. Like, I remember Steve going, he's like, we're doing a good job. We
Yes.
want our boys to be independent and we want them to launch. And like, no, I want them to stay forever. One of the big things, with so again, I have the emotional elements with burnout. So I was saying yes to too many things. But one of the big things I remember I was at a mom's group thing, and my girlfriend was throwing like a little potluck for everyone. And this one mom, she was, she was ahead of me as far as seasons. So
Yes.
she was actually sending her last child to college. And so she was officially going to be 100% an empty nester. And she was sharing openly about like, oh, I'm, just dropped my 5th child off. So in my head, I'm like, oh, I have 5 kids. And, so we're launching her and all that stuff. And so I thought when it came my time to talk, because we're all sharing like highs and lows and how we could be praying for one another, I was like, I want to get wisdom from this woman. And I'm like, I'm getting ready to launch my first 2 boys because they both launched at the same time.
Yes.
And which was so hard. But I said to her, I'm like, how do you handle that? What does that look like? And she just looked me in the eyes, and I felt like she looked into my heart, Zan. And it was like, you have too much of your identity wrapped up in being a mom. And she's like, your identity is in the Lord. And I was like, and at first, it's one of those things when somebody says it to you and you're like, that's me. Like, that's not
right.
me. And I was like,
this is none of your business, by the way.
I'm like, I was asking a simple question. We have 5 kids. I'm launching my first. You launched your last. You're supposed to have encouragement. And, but it hit me. I was like, oh my goodness. And I think that that's part of the problem that we enter into when we're looking at burnout as well, is that when we're allowing our head to stay stuck in believing different lies. And so I was believing this crazy lie that I was being rejected by my kids when they're doing what we've been training them to do.
What you raised them to do.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But then I was also allowing this lie that my identity was 100% wrapped up in being a mom. And I needed to remember, and I still need to remember, that first and foremost, I am a daughter of a king. I am chosen. I am treasured. I am valued. And, I am safe in his economy. Like, he works all things together for the good of those who love him. And so that has been the bigger part of my journey, is really trying to decipher what lies am I believing? Because when you're believing those lies and you have a lot on your plate, it leads to burnout quickly.
Yes,
and I think
very.
I remember people always, the great advice you're given at different times, and people are like, just lean on the Lord for strength. I remember like, what does that mean? Like, what?
Right. I am. That's what I've spent my whole life doing. Yes.
Right. But then it was like when the Lord kind of introduced us to homeschooling, introduced us to, to having 5 kids and a husband who traveled. Oh, and that's on top of everything else happening. My husband is traveling like crazy. But yeah, like I reached the end of myself. Like, yeah, like you said, within 3 hours of the day. Not even that sometimes. Sometimes I wake up and I'm like, I'm done. And so you have to learn what that means to lean on the Lord for strength. And sometimes that's just going to his word and just being like, I got nothing. So Lord, I need you to give me something. So that's my long-winded answer.
And sometimes, no, that is such a great answer. And sometimes it can just be one event. Like I remember John and Ty was a junior in college and John was a freshman, and they had both gone to Covenant College together that year, and which is about 350 miles from us. And so I felt like somebody had cut off my right arm and my left arm. And Lizzie and I were still at home, and we loved each other, and it was so much fun. And I cherished that time with her. But,
yes,
I'm also grieving the family life we had, the unity we had. And in the middle of all that, Ty took a new migraine medicine and it caused him to go blind in his right eye. And
What?
and
I don't
so
think I heard
then
that.
yeah, so that happened, and then one of the doctors said, "Well, maybe it's not the migraine medicine at all. Maybe it's multiple. Maybe it was mitochondrial myopathy, which is really a terminal thing." And so all these doctors are getting together, and they don't know what's wrong and what's caused it and what it really was. It took a while to come up with a diagnosis. Meanwhile, Ty's there on a soccer scholarship, and the child loved soccer. I mean, he's 20 at this point. He's not a child, but I mean, he had played soccer since he was 4 years old and he couldn't play anymore. And it was hard for him to study with one eye. It's the only difference was Ty really embraced this with faith and I did not. I mean, I'll never forget Ty calling me and saying, "Hey mom, you know, how sometimes I lose the vision in my right eye, but it always comes back." I said, "Yeah." He said, "This time it's not back." So I remember getting in the car, knowing that I needed to be in Chattanooga and really realizing how profoundly this could change his life. And so we went through several months and then it really and so all right, so I need to say after a year and a half, miraculously his eyesight came back.
Oh, good,
It
because
was
like, that's
a
all I'm thinking about. I'm like,
Yes,
"How
it
did I
it
not know
was
this?"
it was really a miracle, but during this process, I just got really depressed. I don't know if it was depressed, burnout. It's just sort of like pick whichever one you wanna call it. And so Lizzie and I would drive to Chattanooga, and there were different people on Lookout Mountain that would just let us use their mountain home so that all of us could be together. Joe was like Steve, he was traveling all the time, and we appreciated his work, but he couldn't be there. And I just never forget this one time we were staying in yet another mountain house. Lizzie and I would try to get up there once every 2 weeks, and there were a lot of people on the mountain who were helping Ty if he had doctor's appointments. But I just wanted to be there. Our doctor friends said, if he's not depressed, leave him there by all means. Let him stay where he's happy.
Yeah.
And he was functioning. And so I'll never forget one night we were there. We'd just gone to bed. Lizzie decided to sleep in the room with her brothers, so they could all be together. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, she comes and gets in bed with me. And she says, Mom, I've been appointed by the family to ask you a question. And I'm thinking, so it can't wait till in the morning. No, ma'am. She said, you've always taught us that God is good and God is sovereign. And we want to know when you're going to start living that way again. It was
Ooh,
like that woman saying that to you.
yes.
Lizzie just looked into my soul, my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter. And part of me just wanted to scream, this is my son. If I want to be depressed, I'll be depressed. But it was,
Right.
you know, but
You
it was
tell me
like,
when you're a parent.
yeah. But it was like the Lord was saying to me, your faith matters to your children, Zan. They are watching the way you respond to this really awful circumstance in your life. And I'll never forget that moment thinking, okay, I have got, I don't have to pull myself up by the bootstraps because we're believers and we trust the Holy Spirit to do that. But I needed to start cooperating. And I needed to start focusing on the author and finisher of my faith
Yes.
and not the circumstances. I mean, I was in that ocean looking at those waves. And sometimes we just get to the end of our ropes and the end of ourselves. And maybe that's when the Lord really meets with us. And so, but I do want to encourage moms that you do work through these things, through these awful times. And it's funny the things the Lord uses in your lives to bring you to the end of yourself, but also to encourage you in the process.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts of homeschooling is that honestly, that's the real schooling. Your kids you get to be with them and they're with you as life is happening. Like we've
Yes.
had family members pass away. We've had, emergency surgeries in family. I literally had to fly to Spain in a moment's notice. I got the text at 7 a.m. I need you. I was there. I was on a plane by 2 p.m. to fly out to Spain, and I spent a week there just trying to get this family member home. And so I know what Spain's hospitals look like, but not a lot outside of that. I was like, you went to Spain? I'm like, yeah, it wasn't the trip I wanted. But, like they see like what life looks like. They see what it's like to be the wife who's there to encourage her husband. And who's standing in, the gap as he's traveling and working hard for our family. They get to see me as a daughter there for my parents during different times. They get to see me as a friend. We welcomed a family to live in our house for 6 months, and they were a large family. And so they got to see what that dynamic looks like. They see what it's like when mom goes down for the count because I'm the one having surgery unexpectedly. They get to see these different things. And I think that's what we often forget in the middle of parenting, in the middle of homeschooling, in the middle of everything, is that ultimately we want our kids to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength.
That's
And
right.
they get to see that as we live it out, as you just talked about. But we also we want to prepare them for the life ahead. And it's not about getting the best well-paying job, which is what society is telling us we need to focus on. And that's not the big picture. God's going to take care of all of that. The big picture is I want them to be followers of Christ. I want them to be exceptional spouses and parents. And, they're going to be just like me, a sinner who messes up. But that is the beauty of it too. And I think that kind of, it gets us back to burnout and trials and depression and, whatever it is. God really, he doesn't waste a thing. He doesn't.
That's exactly
And
right.
it's beautiful when sometimes I think in those moments are when he is showing off. I'm at the bottom and he's like, Kristi, do I finally have your attention? Because let me show you who I am. And I will never forget, Zan. I'm going to try not to be emotional in sharing this, but my dad, so, yay, blessed event. My son's getting married. We're hosting the wedding in our backyard. So all these wonderful things are happening. And a month before the wedding, my dad lands in the hospital. My dad does not live in town. And it was 6 months of taking care of him, having to drive out. I think he was 5 or 6 hours away. So driving out, trying to help him there, trying to figure out where he's gotten transferred to. And just taking care of him on and off for 6 months, trying to take care of the hot mess of a financial situation that he and my deceased uncle had left for me to figure out. And it was just a lot of chaos during that time. And it was in, he was basically put on hospice. And because he had kidney failure, hospice meant that dialysis stopped, which means he was not going to make it a
Oh,
week.
wow.
And so I knew that I had this limited time with my dad. And I remember it was a very sweet time in that my best friend flew out and was there for me. And she literally, we pulled the curtain and she just kind of sat behind the curtain. So when my dad would wake up, he'd see me. I mean, he got to see her and talk to her, but she was there for a couple days. And he just was very out of it. But she was there for me. I was there for him. And she had to leave, go back to, her life. And that night driving home, I just remember feeling a love that I had never felt before, and just feeling how the Lord loved me so much. And it was, I love how God works even through little things. A song came on the radio. It was by Francesca Battistelli, and it was all about how God is good. And she talks about how, the song, I think literally says storms come and storms go, and it's hard to find meaning in it all. But one thing remains, God is good. And I just remember I'm sobbing and I'm just singing this song out loud, but it was just that perfect timing. And then the next morning when I'm driving back to the hospital, because I was staying with a friend, I'm driving back to the hospital, and that CeCe Winans song, I think it's God is good, but it's yeah, I think that's the name of it. But anyway, I'm sobbing and I'm singing this out. And what I wasn't even realizing, I'm singing this over my dad in his hospital bed. And, I didn't realize that people were hearing it too. And so I was able to, in that moment, even minister to the nurses that were, the different people who were there in the hospice wing. But just by what God was putting in my heart. But, James 1, when it talks about how, when we go through trials, he is working in us this deeper purpose and this character that comes from it. And I really believe that when we go through crisis, it helps to develop our character, but it also helps to develop our calling. And so oftentimes when you're in the pit, sometimes I'm learning so much faster to really look at it and be like, Lord, what are you going to do with this for your glory? Because I know it's coming. Like, I know just through life, through my 50 years on this earth, that he uses it all. And it's just beautiful to see how he ties it all together and he brings those people in your life that know exactly, you can say, I get it. And then that right there is sometimes a ministry. So it's just, yeah, it's amazing to see how God brings it all together.
So, would you say that was your time of burnout, or that was your time of depression, or were both of those things operating at the same time?
At that phase, it was the depression. I think that burnout, I like to think of ways of like, well, brain highways. So, like when I have coping mechanisms, I think depression ended up being a coping mechanism. So when I would start feeling overwhelmed and feeling some of the tastes of burnout, I had never really struggled with depression before, but I feel like once I started struggling with depression, it just got easier and easier that when something would happen, whoop, it was just so easy to slip back into feeling depressed. So at that time, I didn't have as much on my plate because the wedding finished, so we were done with that. And I mean, as you and probably most people know, like when big things are happening, you don't realize how unimportant so many things are and how you can just like wipe things off your plate. So I think during that time, it was definitely depression. I mean, my dad, unfortunately, was not a great dad. He was a source of a lot of my childhood pain, and I did not have to be there for him in that moment. But God gave me a love for him that was 100% from him, and so it was beautiful. Like there was a beauty in that, but I will say that it brought back a lot, and so that was very hard. So I would say that was more the depression. At that phase with that particular thing, but it works in tandem sometimes. So the burnout can get me there, but so can just depression. So
Thank you for joining Kristi and me today for part 1 of this 2-part episode as we discuss the joys and pressures of homeschooling. You can find Kristi at KristiClover.com, and as always, you can find me at ZanTyler.com and on social media. May God continue to bless you and your family. Until next time, bye.